Hey friends, so today I'm going to show you how I went about painting this cherry illustration. It's mostly watercolor, but I also used a little bit of gouache to get those highlights. So let's go ahead and get started. So to start, I taped off the border with a little bit of washi tape, and then I got a little bit of my art masking fluid, and I'm going to paint the cherry and the stems because I really want to start with my background first. And so what the art masking fluid allows me to do is to cover up the areas that I don't want any paint on, and that way I don't have to like avoid it. It like can sort of slow you down a little bit having to paint around the cherries and the stem, especially something as kind of narrow and thin as the stem. It can be ripe for errors, right? So I chose to lay down some art masking fluid, and then once I've laid all that down, I'm going to let it dry completely. So once it dries completely, and you can tell that it like changes color a little bit, it gets a little bit darker when it's fully dry, but I usually just like to touch it to make sure. But once that's done, I can go ahead to my next step, which is to paint in the background. So I know that kind of a teal blue, a greeny blue goes really well with like the deep red of the cherries. And so that's what I'm going to go ahead and mix up. And you can see I'm already kind of pre-wetting my paints. That's the Mungyo 48 pan set. I prefer working with the pan paints, but you do have to activate them with a little spray bottle or whatever. So I'm going to mix up a few different blues and play around with the different blues until I get the background color that I want. And now that I got the color that I wanted, I at first thought I wanted to do stripes, which is a big reason why originally I wanted to definitely put down the art masking fluid, because I thought it would be an easier way to have sort of like the continuous stripe going behind the cherries. So I used this kind of flathead brush to get the a little bit more of a stripe. But as I progressed, and it sort of took me an embarrassingly long time to realize that what I had decided to do didn't really work. And I think it didn't really work for a couple reasons. I think I didn't map out where I wanted the stripes to be. I didn't decide whether I wanted it to be, sort of a little imperfect as far as the width of the stripes, the amount of white space in between the stripes. Like, I didn't have a really clear vision for that. And so then as I kind of kept going, I felt like some of my stripes got really thicker than others, and some of them were further apart or had more white space in between them than others. And it just like didn't look right to me. It just didn't feel like it was gonna work. I don't know quite why it didn't work, but the nice thing about watercolor is when you kind of feel like you've painted yourself into a corner, there's a way to save it. So I ultimately did decide to scrap this stripe idea. So I think in particular, these last two stripes are where I went really wrong. Like, it's not very appealing. Looking at the different, I don't know, I think they needed to be thicker and further apart for this to work. And it just looks a little too, I don't want to say homemade, but just not great, not visually interesting. And again, I'm still trying to make fetch happen. I'm like 4 stripes into this before I just start thinking, this isn't working. You can see I'm kind of futzing with them a little bit, trying to see if I can, make something happen. But again, I'm just keep going with this. Yeah, so it's kind of at this point that I realize, ooh, this did not work, especially at the end when I had that really thick, awful stripe. I think I was kind of basically done with doing that. So what I've decided to do now is I took a lot of like water and I got a lot of paint on my brush, and I'm gonna fill in the spaces where I left blank, obviously, where I left some white space. And then I decided to even mix it up further. So you can see I'm just getting a ton of water on my brush and a ton of paint on my brush, just to kind of like, I don't want too much of the background stripes to show up because obviously a lot of this watercolor has already dried. So my first step to fixing this was to just really lay down a lot of color and get the area pretty wet and saturated with that color. So you can see the stripes are showing through and not in a particularly aesthetically pleasing way. So I mixed up a little bit more paint and I went with more of a green color. And while this is still wet, like the background is still wet, I'm just gonna like drop in some of that darker color paint just in different areas, just to sort of, I don't know, make it mottled a little bit in the background and a little bit more, I don't know, sort of like watercolory in terms of just being like dropping in the paint and letting it move how it wants to. Another thing that I decided to do is I took a darker color, a darker blue, and I went sort of behind to one side of the cherries and the stems and put in a little bit of shadow because I wanted it to seem like the cherries were 3D casting a shadow. So I thought that was a little bit fun too, to add a little bit of depth there. And as you can see, I have a couple different blues. I have a more of an indigo blue that I'm using for the shadow areas, and that teal blue is greenish blue is for the rest of the painting, just to drop in color and get like a little bit of a mottled look. And at this point, I decided to use a little bit more fun watercolor strategies. So I got a rolled up tissue and I blotted some areas just to kind of add a little bit of like splotchiness. And I really liked this kind of effect. And I kept adding back in some more paint, but then, you know, blotting it at various points later on as well until I ended up with the effect that I liked. And you can see I just kind of keep building up the color as the background dries. I'm adding in a little bit more here and there, lifting up some with the paper towel. And I just thought it kind of had a really fun effect there. So once the watercolor background dries, I can use an eraser to get me started to pull up the art masking fluid there. And you can see the underneath the masking fluid, it's totally undisturbed. And I can paint any color on there that I like. So this is a really great tool to have in your toolkit, and you can get it at any art store near you or, you know, online. Now that I kind of have some blank page in terms of the cherry, I'm going to start mixing up some reds, and I'm going to mix up a few different varieties of reds, some tones. So I'll have just kind of a plain red and some lighter reds as well. So you see that I mix in some white and a little bit of, or quite a bit of water to get that white lightened up. And one of the things that I'm really bad about is not cleaning off my brush before I dip into that white. But it doesn't end up like hurting me too much. I thought that white looked a little bit too pastel-y. And so one of the things that I chose to do to tone it down a little bit was to add in a touch of green, so that it was not quite as like Easter pink, spring pink colory. I wanted it to be a little bit more of a natural color. So I put a little bit of green, which sits opposite red on the color wheel. That's its contrasting color. And that kind of gives it a little bit of a deeper color, and it takes out the pastel. And then I'm going to have a really dark, rich red as well, kind of almost more like a purpley red. And that's going to be for the shadows of the cherries. So as usual, I'm going to start with my lightest color first. So I'm going to put down the lightest red that I have on my palette there mixed up. And I'm going to really put a ton of water in. You can see I picked up a little bit of the color, and I also got some more water on my brush so that it's very, very faint. And I like to be a little bit conservative with application of color at this juncture, because if I go too dark, especially with red is like a tricky color for me, because sometimes, if you put a color down and maybe it's a little bit too dark, you can lift it. You can either lift it with a clean brush, like clean damp brush, or with a paper towel, like a dry paper towel. But red really stains. It stains the paper. So I went very, very conservative on my first application of color on those cherries, because I really just didn't want to overdo it. And I can always build up, but it's really hard to dial back. So I waited for that first layer that I applied to dry before I went in with this darker sort of, I don't know, mid-tone red. And the reason for that is it's such a small area, and any area that's wet, the the pigment is gonna travel to. So if you want to sort of keep and retain some of those like different shades, you're gonna have to wait for things to dry before applying more. So I'm just kind of like being, again, like I said, a little bit careful and taking my time with this part, because unlike the blue background, I think it's a little bit more, going to be a little more challenging to fix. And one other thing I'll point out is I don't really have a preference for harsh lines. And you see what I just did. I had on that first cherry that I had added another layer to, I cleaned off my brush so it was still damp. And then I just sort of went along that line just to kind of soften it up. Like, so you kind of like scrub a little bit on the line to add a little bit more softness there. And I'm also going to try to get the first layer of green down for the stem. And it's a little bit ill-advised to have been doing this on this cherry, because I'm about to touch some part of the cherry that is still wet, and you're going to see that green travel a little bit further into the red than I wanted it to. But, there's kind of an easier fix for that. I think at some point I grab a paper towel and I kind of fix that up. Now, this other cherry, it's not as much of a problem because that area where I'm painting is already dry. So I can put the green over it and it's not going to go where I don't want it to go. And yeah, so here I'm going to dab up some of that green because it traveled further than I wanted it to, because the area around it is still wet. Whereas on this cherry on the right, that area is totally dry, so I don't need to worry about the green going into areas that I don't want it to go. So at this point, I'm going to add my mid-range red color, and I'm going to start at the bottom where I'm going to be thinking that the cherry would be the darkest, right? It wouldn't be seen as much light. And then also I wanted to show a little bit of like the dip that you would see where the stem kind of goes into the cherry, just to show that like sense of 3D and depth. And so you'll see me kind of start to mark that in there where the stem is gonna meet, and there's kind of like a little indentation. and quite a bit of a shadow there. And again, I don't like these kind of harsh lines, so I try to sort of clean off my brush and scrub a little bit, and so that way it just kind of looks a little bit more of natural. And I'm going to do the same thing over here on the other cherry. Okay, so I built up the color a little bit more with that kind of mid-tone red. Now I'm ready to add in the sort of dark cherry red, I guess, towards the bottom. Again, that's going to be to me the darkest part of the cherry. And I'm just going to go back and forth. That's still a little bit damp. So you can see I'm just kind of dropping some of that color in at the bottom, and it's starting to move to other places where the cherry is still wet. So I decided to let it dry a little bit, and because I was kind of worried that that darker shadow color would take over a little bit too much of the painting. So I wanted to sort of start from just sort of dry and then, you know, fill in where I want to see a little bit more of that shadow color around the bottom and also around the crease where the stem meets the cherry. And I wanted to have a little bit more control of where the paint was going. And so to achieve that, I made sure that I waited till the paint dried. So at this point, I think I forgot to hit record, but I got a little bit of my white gouache, which gouache paint is, it can either be acrylic or watercolor based. Mine is actually watercolor based. But it's a thicker consistency than watercolor, so you can paint over. Obviously, I wouldn't be able to dip into that white in my watercolor and achieve this effect. I need the gouache, that thicker consistency, to be able to cover up the pigment of watercolor. But I wanted to achieve a little bit of highlight there, and I think I did that. And I also think I missed painting where I put a little bit of a shadow on the right side, a little bit of a darker green on the right side of each one of those stems too. So I think I kind of missed that point. So at this point I had pulled up the washi tape and you can see those nice clean edges. But I also thought it would be kind of fun to add the other part of the cherries so that they sort of look like they're on top of the background. So there you see me just kind of finishing off. I like to kind of sketch things before I go ahead and paint them. So I'm just filling in some of the red to finish out those cherries on each side. And that's my final painting. So I hope you enjoyed this. Please like and subscribe if you'd like to see more watercolor videos from me. Thanks for watching.